The biting Detroit wind, a sculptor of snowflakes, swirled around Benjamin Ellis as he locked the community college doors. The night was a deep indigo, punctuated by the hesitant glow of streetlights, each casting long, dancing shadows on the freshly fallen snow. Inside, the scent of old books and chalk dust still lingered in his nostrils, a comforting aroma that spoke of intellectual pursuits and the quiet hum of minds engaged. Benjamin, a man carved from quiet strength and intellectual curiosity, pulled his worn wool coat tighter, the collar scratching gently against his neck. He loved this time of night, the city quieting down, allowing for introspection. He wasn't just a philosophy teacher. He was a weaver of possibilities. Each lecture, each Socratic dialogue, was a thread he carefully spun into the minds of his students, hoping to create a tapestry of critical thought and empathetic understanding. He believed in the power of ideas, in the slow burn of enlightenment that could ignite social change. His students, a diverse mix of Detroit's vibrant tapestry, young mothers returning to education, veterans seeking new purpose, recent immigrants, eager to understand their adopted land, they were his hope, his canvas for a better world. He saw in their earnest faces the potential for a more just and equitable future, a future built on dialogue, not division. Tonight's class on existentialism had been particularly engaging. They had wrestled with Sartre and Camus, grappling with freedom, responsibility, and the absurd beauty of existence. He'd seen sparks of genuine insight in their eyes, heard the tentative yet courageous articulation of their own philosophies. It was moments like these that reaffirmed his purpose, that pushed back against the cynicism that sometimes threatened to creep in from the world outside the classroom walls. He carried the weight of history, the awareness of systemic inequalities, but he refused to let it crush his spirit. Instead, he channeled it into his teaching, into a quiet revolution of the mind. As he walked to his car, a reliable but aging sedan, he thought of his father, a factory worker who had instilled in him the value of education and the importance of holding your head high, regardless of circumstance. His father's calloused hands and quiet dignity were etched in Benjamin's memory, a constant source of strength. He started the engine, the rumble of familiar comfort in the stillness of the night. The snowflakes, now falling more steadily, painted the city in a soft, ethereal light. He was heading home, not just to his apartment, but to the quiet sanctuary of his own thoughts, ready to prepare for another day of sparking dialogue and nurturing minds. Little did he know, tonight's journey home held a lesson far beyond the philosophical texts he so diligently studied, a lesson etched not in ink, but in the stark reality of flashing blue and red lights. This night, Detroit would offer him a different kind of classroom, one where the curriculum was unspoken and the examination unexpectedly personal. The drive started as it usually did, a familiar rhythm of streets and stop signs. The city, even hushed under a blanket of snow, possessed a pulse, a low thrum of life that Benjamin found strangely comforting. He hummed along to a Miles Davis track playing softly on the radio, the cool jazz notes weaving through his thoughts. He was replaying a student's insightful question about the nature of authenticity, pondering how best to address it in the next class. His mind was still in the classroom, still engaged in the intellectual dance of philosophy. Then, the intrusion. A flicker of blue in his rearview mirror, initially dismissed as a reflection from a nearby storefront. But then the red joined the dance, insistent, undeniable. The flashing lights grew larger, closer, painting the snow-covered street in an urgent, pulsating hue. Benjamin's internal rhythm faltered. His jazz soundtrack seemed to fade into the background as a cold knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He checked his speedometer, perfectly within the limit. He signaled meticulously and eased his car towards the curb, the crunch of snow under his tires a stark sound in the sudden silence. He switched off the engine, placing his hands deliberately on the steering wheel, a gesture of calm compliance he'd learned was sometimes necessary. He watched in his rearview mirror as the police cruiser pulled in behind him, its headlights cutting through the falling snow, illuminating his car in a stark, almost theatrical spotlight. Two figures emerged, silhouetted against the flashing lights, their shapes solid and imposing. He could feel his heart rate quicken, a primal response to the uniform, the authority, the unknown. He took a slow, deep breath, consciously calming himself. He was Benjamin Ellis, a teacher, a respected member of his community. He had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Yet, the weight of history, the subtle and not-so-subtle biases that permeated society, whispered in the back of his mind. He knew, instinctively, that this routine check, as the officer would likely call it, might not be entirely routine for someone who looked like him, driving in this part of Detroit on a winter night. He prepared himself for the interaction, steeling his composure, resolving to maintain his dignity, regardless of what was to come. The officers were approaching, their footsteps crunching in the snow, their faces still obscured by shadow and the swirling snowflakes. The ordinary evening had abruptly veered into the realm of the unexpected, and Benjamin was poised, ready to navigate the complexities that lay ahead, armed with nothing but his composure and the quiet strength of his convictions. The first officer, a man with a surprisingly youthful face despite the stern set of his jaw, approached Benjamin's window. His partner hung back slightly, a silent observer, adding to the subtle pressure of the situation. The officer leaned in, the cold air rushing into the car, carrying with it the faint scent of winter and something else, something metallic and official. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his voice indeed gentle, almost incongruously so given the circumstances. "License and registration, please." Benjamin's movements were slow and deliberate as he reached into his glove compartment, retrieving the requested documents. He handed them over, his gaze meeting the officer's briefly, searching for any flicker of emotion, any clue to the reason for this stop. He found only professional detachment, a practiced neutrality that was both reassuring and unsettling. "Of course, officer," Benjamin replied, his voice calm and even. He had learned the art of maintaining composure, of projecting an air of quiet, confidence, even when his inner anxieties were stirring. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" He posed the question politely, respectfully, but with a firm undercurrent of inquiry. He deserved to know, to understand the basis for this interruption of his evening. The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Benjamin noticed it. A flicker of discomfort, a slight shift in his gaze. It was a subtle tell, a crack in the facade of routine. "Just a routine check, sir," the officer repeated, the words sounding practiced, almost rehearsed. "We're ensuring safety during the holiday season." "Routine," Benjamin echoed internally. The word hung in the cold air, laden with unspoken implications. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the explanation, but not necessarily accepting it at face value. He was acutely aware that routine often had different meanings depending on who you were and where you were. He knew the statistics, the disproportionate stops, the inherent biases that could seep into even the most well-intentioned systems. He chose not to challenge the officer directly, at least not yet. He understood that sometimes the most effective resistance was quiet observation, a steady gaze that acknowledged the surface explanation while silently questioning the undercurrents. He allowed a slight, polite smile to touch his lips. "Of course, officer. Safety is paramount." He kept his tone neutral, neither confrontational nor overly subservient. He was walking a delicate tightrope, trying to assert his right to be treated with respect while avoiding any action that could be misconstrued as resistance or aggression. The officer turned away, taking his documents towards the cruiser, leaving Benjamin in the relative quiet of his car, the flashing lights still painting the interior in their unsettling rhythm. The routine check had begun, and Benjamin was left to contemplate the layers of complexity that lay beneath the surface of those two simple words. Benjamin watched in his rearview mirror as the officer reached the cruiser, the snow swirling around him like a ghostly cloak. He saw the officer speak briefly to his partner, then disappear into the vehicle, presumably to run his license and registration. The wait stretched, each second amplifying the tension. The silence in his car was broken only by the soft hiss of the defroster and the distant, muffled sounds of the city. His mind began to race, replaying the drive, searching for any possible infraction, any reason, however flimsy, for this stop. Had he drifted slightly out of his lane? Was his taillight flickering? He could find no logical explanation. The officer emerged from the cruiser, not immediately returning to Benjamin's car, but pausing by the open driver's side door of the police vehicle, speaking again to his partner. Their conversation was hushed, inaudible, but the body language was telling. Gestures were exchanged, glances directed towards Benjamin's car. It was no longer a simple quick check. Something had shifted. The routine was becoming less routine. Finally, the first officer returned, walking slowly, deliberately, towards Benjamin's window. He no longer held the documents. His demeanor, though still outwardly polite, seemed to have hardened slightly. The gentle tone from before was replaced by a more formal, official cadence. He leaned in again, the cold air a sharper bite this time. "Mr. Ellis," he began, his voice now devoid of any trace of warmth. "Everything appears to be in order with your license and registration. Thank you for that." He paused, then continued, his gaze now direct and unwavering. "However, we do have a few further questions for you if you don't mind." "Of course, officer," Benjamin replied, maintaining his composure, but his internal alarm bells were ringing louder now. "What questions do you have?" He braced himself, sensing the shift in the encounter, the subtle escalation. "We've had some reports in this neighborhood," the officer said, his tone vague, "regarding suspicious activity. Are you familiar with this area, sir?" Benjamin frowned slightly. "Familiar? I drive through this neighborhood to get home from work. I teach at the community college just a few blocks from here." He stated it plainly, matter-of-factly, hoping to establish context, to dispel any notion of suspicion. "And where are you coming from this evening, Mr. Ellis?" The question was simple, direct, but the undercurrent was clear. It was an interrogation, however softly veiled. The routine check had morphed into something else entirely. Benjamin knew with a sinking feeling that this was no longer about traffic safety. The questions were probing, the focus shifting, and the unspoken question hung heavy in the frigid air. "Why are you a black man in this neighborhood at this time of night? Suspicious activity." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Benjamin felt a familiar knot of anger and frustration tightening in his chest, but he consciously pushed it down, replacing it with a mask of polite inquiry. He knew that anger, however justified, could be easily misinterpreted, could escalate the situation in ways he wanted to avoid. He needed to remain calm, to navigate this carefully, to diffuse the unspoken suspicion that was now palpable in the cold night air. "As I mentioned, officer, I'm coming from the community college," Benjamin repeated, his voice even and controlled. "I teach evening classes there. Philosophy." He added the last word almost as an afterthought, a subtle attempt to humanize himself, to paint a picture of a life beyond the stereotypes that might be clouding their judgment. The officer nodded slowly, as if processing this information, but his expression remained unchanged, neutral, unreadable. "And you reside in which part of the city, Mr. Ellis?" The questions were becoming more personal, more invasive, straying further and further from the initial premise of a routine check. Benjamin provided his address, a modest apartment in a less affluent part of town, knowing instinctively that this information, too, would likely be scrutinized, judged, perhaps even used against him in some subtle, unspoken way. He felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling awareness of being viewed not as an individual, but as a category, a demographic, a potential suspect. Internally, a storm was brewing. He felt the familiar sting of racial profiling, the injustice of being judged, based on the color of his skin, the neighborhood he was in, the time of night. He thought of his father, of the countless stories he had heard growing up about similar encounters, about the constant, low-level hum of prejudice that permeated everyday life. He thought of his students, of the lessons he taught about justice, equality, and the importance of critical thinking, and he felt a surge of resolve. He would not succumb to bitterness. He would not allow this encounter to strip him of his dignity. He would remain composed. He would answer their questions truthfully, but he would also subtly assert his right to be treated with respect, to be seen as an individual, not a stereotype. He met the officer's gaze directly, his eyes reflecting a quiet strength, a refusal to be intimidated. He knew that this encounter was about more than just a traffic stop. It was a microcosm of a larger societal issue, a reminder of the persistent inequalities that he fought against, in his own small way, every day in his classroom. And in this moment, on this cold Detroit street, he was not just Benjamin Ellis, the philosophy teacher. He was Benjamin Ellis, a black man in America, navigating the complexities of a system that often seemed designed to question his presence, to cast suspicion upon his very existence. And he would do so with grace, with dignity, and with the unwavering hope for a future where such encounters would be relegated to the history books, not the lived realities of another winter night in Detroit. While the first officer continued his line of questioning, the second officer, who had remained silently observing from the cruiser, began to move. He approached Benjamin's car from the passenger side, his movements slower, more deliberate than his partner's. He didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, but his presence was a palpable shift in the dynamic. It was a silent escalation, a doubling down on the show of authority. Benjamin watched him in his peripheral vision, his senses heightened, acutely aware of the officer circling his vehicle. He saw the officer's hand rest briefly on his gun, holster, a casual gesture perhaps, but one that sent a shiver of unease down Benjamin's spine. He kept his focus on the first officer, maintaining eye contact, but his awareness was split. His attention divided between the spoken questions and the unspoken pressure emanating from the second officer's silent scrutiny. The first officer continued, his questions becoming slightly more pointed, more probing. "Do you mind if we ask you a few questions about your activities this evening, Mr. Ellis? Just to clarify a few things." The vagueness was deliberate, the lack of specificity designed to keep Benjamin off balance, to elicit a reaction, perhaps even a slip-up. "My activities?" Benjamin echoed, his voice still calm, but with a subtle edge of steel creeping in. "I was teaching a philosophy class, as I said. What other activities would you be referring to?" He held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the implied accusation, the unspoken suspicion. At that moment, the second officer reached the passenger side window and tapped lightly on the glass. It was a small gesture, almost polite, but it was also a clear signal. A signal of what? A signal of impending further intrusion. The first officer turned his head slightly, acknowledging his partner with a barely perceptible nod. Then he turned back to Benjamin, his expression still neutral, but his eyes now holding a glint of something harder, something more assertive. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more formal, more authoritative. "For our safety and yours, we're going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The words hung in the air, the polite veneer finally cracking, revealing the underlying power dynamic. The routine check had completely dissolved, replaced by something far more confrontational, far more unsettling. Benjamin knew, with a cold certainty, that this was no longer about ensuring safety. This was about control, about assertion of authority, and about the unspoken prejudices that had led them to stop him in the first place. The night, once quiet and reflective, was now charged with a dangerous tension, and Benjamin was caught in its unforgiving current. Benjamin hesitated for a fraction of a second. Step out of the vehicle. It wasn't a request, it was an instruction, veiled in the language of procedure, but laced with the implicit threat of force. He knew his rights. He knew he didn't have to step out unless they had probable cause. But he also knew that asserting those rights in this moment could escalate the situation, could lead to unnecessary confrontation, perhaps even violence. He weighed his options in a split second, the cold air seeping into his car, chilling him to the bone, both literally and figuratively. He decided for now to comply. Compliance didn't mean submission. It meant strategic maneuvering. It meant choosing his battles. He would step out. He would observe. He would assess, and he would decide his next move based on their actions, not just their words. He reached for the door handle, his movement slow and deliberate, giving himself a moment to gather his thoughts, to steel his resolve. As he opened the door, the biting Detroit wind rushed in, a physical manifestation of the coldness of the situation. He stepped out onto the snow-covered street, the crunch of his shoes echoing the tension in the air. The flashing lights of the cruiser seemed to intensify, bathing him in their harsh, judgmental glare. He stood beside his car, facing the officers, his hands visible, his posture open, non-threatening. He was a picture of calm compliance, but inside, his mind was racing, his senses on high alert. "Turn around slowly, sir, and face your vehicle," the first officer instructed, his voice, now devoid of any pretense of gentleness. It was a command, barked out into the cold night. Benjamin obeyed, turning slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements measured, controlled. He placed his hands on the hood of his car, the cold metal biting through his gloves. He could feel the officers approaching, their footsteps crunching in the snow behind him, their presence closing in, tightening the circle of control around him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath, trying to center himself amidst the swirling chaos. He thought of his students, of the discussions they had about dignity and resistance, about the power of nonviolent protest. He thought of his father, of his quiet strength, his unwavering resilience in the face of adversity. He drew strength from these memories, from these principles, and he prepared himself for whatever was to come. He was standing in the cold, under the harsh glare of police lights, feeling the weight of suspicion, the sting of injustice, but he was also standing tall, his spirit unbroken, his dignity intact. He was Benjamin Ellis, and he would not be defined by this moment. He would rise above it. He would emerge from this encounter stronger, more determined than ever to fight for a world where such moments would no longer be commonplace, where dignity and respect were not privileges, but rights for everyone. With Benjamin positioned against his car, the officers moved quickly and efficiently. The first officer began a pat-down search, his hands moving briskly over Benjamin's coat, his pockets, his waist. It was perfunctory, impersonal, but deeply invasive, a violation of his personal space, his dignity. Benjamin stood still, his jaw clenched, his muscles tense, enduring the search with a forced calm. He refused to flinch, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort, his anger. The second officer, meanwhile, moved to the driver's side door, which Benjamin had left ajar. He opened it wider and began to shine his flashlight. Inside the car, his beam sweeping across the dashboard, the seats, the floor. He was searching, ostensibly for weapons or contraband, but Benjamin knew instinctively that they were searching for something more, something less tangible, something that would confirm their preconceived notions, their unspoken suspicions. "What exactly are you looking for, officers?" Benjamin asked, his voice calm and steady, breaking the tense silence. He addressed the question to both of them, demanding an explanation, refusing to be treated as a non-person, a mere object of their scrutiny. The first officer, without pausing his search, replied curtly, "Standard procedure, sir. Just ensuring your safety and ours." The same vague, meaningless justification, repeated again and again, a thin veil for their real motives. But safety from what? Benjamin pressed, his voice rising slightly, the edge of his control beginning to fray. "I was driving home from teaching class. I haven't violated any laws. What is the basis for this search?" The second officer, still inside the car, straightened up, holding something in his hand. It was a book, a paperback, its cover obscured by the dim light. He stepped out of the car, holding the book up. "What's this, sir?" he asked, his tone accusatory, challenging. Benjamin squinted, trying to see what the officer was holding. "It's a book," he replied, his voice laced with disbelief. It's a philosophy book. I was grading papers. I brought it to class." He felt a surge of incredulity, bordering on outrage. They were now scrutinizing his books, his intellectual pursuits, as if they were evidence of some wrongdoing. The officer flipped through the pages of the book, his expression skeptical. "Philosophy, huh?" he sneered, the word dripping with disdain. "What kind of philosophy are you teaching these days, Mr. Ellis?" The question was loaded, dripping with prejudice, implying that his profession, his intellectual life, were somehow suspect, somehow connected to the suspicious activity they claimed to be investigating. The justification for the stop, for the search, had shifted again, becoming even more absurd, more transparently biased. Benjamin felt a wave of anger wash over him, but he fought to maintain control, knowing that losing his temper would only play into their hands, would only confirm their prejudices. He had to remain calm. He had to remain dignified, even in the face of this blatant disrespect, this blatant violation. The officer's sneer, the dismissive tone, the casual disdain for his profession. It was a spark that ignited a quiet fire within Benjamin. He had endured the stop, the questioning, the search, with a stoic composure, but this blatant disrespect for his very identity, for his life's work, was a line he could not allow them to cross unchallenged. He straightened up, pulling away slightly from the hood of his car, his gaze fixed on the officer holding his book. "Philosophy," Benjamin repeated, his voice now firm, resonant, cutting through the cold night air. "I teach philosophy. The study of wisdom, of critical thinking, of ethics, of justice. Concepts, officer, that seem to be conspicuously absent from this encounter." He held the officer's gaze, his eyes unwavering, challenging. He was no longer just complying. He was pushing back, subtly, verbally, asserting his intellectual and moral authority. The officer with the book blinked, momentarily taken aback by Benjamin's directness, his unexpected defiance. He had likely expected meek compliance, perhaps, even fear. He clearly hadn't anticipated this quiet intellectual resistance. He recovered quickly, however, his sneer hardening into a more rigid expression. "Don't get smart with me, sir," he warned, his voice tightening with a hint of threat. "We're just doing our job. And I am simply asking for clarification," Benjamin retorted, his voice still controlled but now laced with a clear, unmistakable defiance. "What exactly is your job, officers? Is it to ensure safety, as you claim? Or is it to harass law-abiding citizens based on what? Based on the color of their skin? Based on the neighborhood they happen to be driving through? Based on the books they read?" He let the questions hang in the air, unanswered, accusatory. The first officer, who had completed the pat-down search and found nothing, stepped forward, placing himself between Benjamin and his partner. He seemed slightly less overtly aggressive than the officer with the book, perhaps sensing that the situation was escalating, that their initial pretext was crumbling under Benjamin's quiet, persistent questioning. "Look, Mr. Ellis," the first officer said, his tone softening slightly, becoming almost conciliatory. "We understand you're frustrated, but we're just trying to keep this neighborhood safe. There have been incidents." He gestured vaguely around, as if the snow-covered streets themselves were evidence of some impending threat. "Incidents?" Benjamin challenged, his voice still firm, but now tinged with a weariness, a deep-seated frustration. "And those incidents justify stopping and searching a philosophy teacher on his way home from work? Is that really the best use of your time and resources, officers? Or is this about something else entirely?" He drew a line in the metaphorical snow, refusing to back down, refusing to let them off the hook with their vague, unsubstantiated justifications. He was asserting his dignity, his humanity, demanding to be seen, not as a suspect, but as a person, a member of the community, deserving of respect, not suspicion. The silence that followed Benjamin's pointed questions was thick with tension. The officers exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance, a silent communication passing between them. Benjamin stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his posture still composed but radiating a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle them. He had challenged their authority, not with anger or aggression, but with logic, with reason, with the simple demand for respect. And in that challenge, something shifted in the dynamic of the encounter. The first officer sighed, a sound of resignation, perhaps even a hint of weariness. He lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Benjamin, his expression softening, losing some of its earlier rigidity. "All right, Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice now noticeably less confrontational. "Look, we appreciate your cooperation." The words sounded forced, almost grudging, but they were a clear signal of de-escalation. He gestured to his partner, who still held Benjamin's philosophy book, a silent instruction. The second officer hesitated for a moment, then closed the book and handed it back to the first officer, who in turn extended it towards Benjamin. "Here's your book, sir," he said, his tone almost perfunctory, as if eager to end the encounter as quickly as possible. Benjamin took the book, his fingers brushing against the officer's briefly. He held it for a moment, a silent symbol of the intellectual dignity they had tried to demean, but had ultimately failed to extinguish. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the gesture, but not offering any further concession, not backing down from the points he had made. "Is that all, officers?" Benjamin asked, his voice still firm but now laced with a hint of weariness. He wanted this to be over, to be able to go home, to process the emotions that were still churning beneath his calm exterior. The first officer nodded again, this time more decisively. "Yes, sir. Everything seems to be in order. You're free to go." The words were clipped, almost brusque, but they were the words Benjamin had been waiting for. The ordeal was over. The routine check that had spiraled into an invasive, unjust encounter was finally coming to an end. He didn't offer a smile, didn't offer any false pleasantries. He simply nodded again, a curt acknowledgement of their release. He turned and walked back to his car, his movements deliberate, his head held high. He opened the door, slid back into the driver's seat, and closed the door behind him with a firm, decisive click. He started the engine, the rumble a welcome sound of normalcy after the tense silence of the encounter. He checked his rear view mirror, saw the police cruiser pulling away, their flashing lights receding into the distance, leaving him alone again on the snow-covered Detroit street. The immediate threat was gone, the tension dissipated, but the echoes of the encounter, the questions it raised, the emotions it stirred, lingered in the cold night air, weaving themselves into the tapestry of his Detroit story. As Benjamin drove away, retracing his route home, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The adrenaline that had kept him composed during the encounter began to recede, leaving behind a lingering weariness, a dull ache in his chest. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white in the dim light of the dashboard. The snow continued to fall, now more gently, almost serenely, as if the city itself was trying to soothe the tension that had just gripped it. He replayed the encounter in his mind, each question, each gesture, each unspoken implication. He felt the sting of the prejudice, the violation of his dignity, the injustice of being judged based on his race, on assumptions, on stereotypes. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered now by a deeper, more complex mix of emotions: frustration, disappointment, a profound sense of weariness, but also a quiet, resilient strength. He thought of his students, of the lessons he tried to impart about justice, about empathy, about critical thinking. He realized that tonight he had lived a lesson, a harsh, unbidden lesson in the realities of systemic bias, in the subtle and not so subtle ways that prejudice manifested itself in everyday life. He had talked to his students about these things, in the abstract, in the theoretical realm of philosophy. But tonight, he had experienced it firsthand, in the raw, visceral reality of flashing blue and red lights on a cold Detroit street. He wondered if the officers would even remember him tomorrow, if this encounter was just another routine stop for them, easily forgotten, easily dismissed. But for him, it was different. It was etched in his memory, a stark reminder of the challenges he faced, not just as a teacher, but as a black man in America. It was a reminder of the constant vigilance required, the perpetual need to navigate a world that often seemed to view him with suspicion, to question his presence, to judge him before they even knew him. Yet, amidst the weariness and the frustration, there was also a flicker of something else, something akin to resolve. He had maintained his composure, he had asserted his dignity, he had refused to be intimidated. He had not succumbed to bitterness, he had not allowed them to strip him of his humanity. He had stood his ground, in his own quiet, intellectual way, and in doing so he had affirmed his own worth, his own value, his own right to exist, to be respected, to be seen. And that, he realized, was a victory, however small, however bittersweet. He drove on, the snowflakes blurring in the headlights, the city lights reflecting in the snow-covered streets, carrying with him the echoes of the encounter, the weight of its implications, but also the quiet strength of his own resilience, his own enduring hope for a better world. Benjamin arrived home, his small apartment a welcome sanctuary of warmth and quiet after the cold, tense encounter. He shrugged off his coat, the weight of it feeling heavier than usual, and poured himself a cup of tea, the steam rising in fragrant wisps, a comforting ritual. He sat by the window looking out at the city lights twinkling through the falling snow, the silence of his apartment a stark contrast to the flashing lights and tense voices of the roadside stop. He sipped his tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into his chilled bones, both physical and emotional. He reflected on the night, on the officers, on the unspoken prejudices that had fueled their actions. He didn't feel bitter, not anymore. He felt thoughtful. He understood that prejudice was not always malicious, not always intentional. Often it was ingrained, systemic, a product of history, of societal conditioning, of unconscious biases that even well-intentioned people could harbor. The officers might have genuinely believed they were just doing their job, even if that job was rooted in flawed assumptions, in discriminatory practices, and that, he realized, was the challenge. Not just to confront overt racism, but to dismantle the subtle, insidious forms of prejudice that permeated society, to challenge the unconscious biases that led to encounters like the one he had just experienced. It was a long, arduous task, a generational struggle, but it was a struggle worth fighting for, a battle worth waging. And his classroom, his philosophy lessons, his quiet dialogues with his students, these were his weapons, his tools in that ongoing struggle. He thought of the initial text, the brief vignette that had sparked this entire night of reflection, this deeper exploration of the encounter. Dignity and respect, even amidst unexpected circumstances, were the keystones of rising above prejudice. The words resonated deeply within him, truer now than ever. He had clung to his dignity. He had demanded respect, not with anger or aggression, but with composure, with reason, with the quiet strength of his convictions. And in doing so, he had, in his own small way, risen above the prejudice. He had refused to be defined by it. He had affirmed his own humanity. Detroit, he mused, was a city of stories, a tapestry woven from countless individual experiences, both joyful and painful, triumphant and tragic. And tonight, his own story. The story of a philosophy teacher stopped on a snowy street, would weave itself into that tapestry, adding its threads of tension, of resilience, of quiet hope. It was a story of an unexpected encounter, yes, but also a story of understanding, of dignity, of the enduring power of the human spirit to rise above prejudice, to find meaning and humanity even in the most unexpected and challenging of circumstances. And as he finished his tea, and the snow continued to fall softly outside his window, Benjamin Ellis knew that he would carry this story with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder, as a testament to the ongoing work of building a better world, one dialogue, one lesson, one act of quiet dignity at a time.